letter the proclamation that sent the original 50,000 Israelites back to Judea. Well, that's recorded in the book of Ezra, right? Now, Ezra, of course, in our normal English Bibles, is before the book of Psalms, right? And Haggai and Zechariah are almost at the end of the Old Testament. Our Bibles are not necessarily just written out chronologically, right? There's basically 5 sections, right? You have like the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. You have the history books, Samuel, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. You have the poetry books, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. You have the major prophets and the minor prophets. And so within each of those sections, there's a chronology. But when you're reading books that then are interspaced, right, the book of Ezra is actually written in 440s or 450s BC, whereas Haggai and Zechariah are actually doing their prophesying at the end of the 6th century, in 520s, 515, somewhere in that range BC. So that is where that is. One other note. So that is where in this chapter of the story, it actually does a really nice synthesis of kind of integrating those kind of archival pieces of the book of Ezra into the flow of the story as Haggai and Zechariah, who overlap briefly, are doing the prophecy. It's kind of a neat synthesis that is actually really useful because if we were reading the book of Haggai or Zechariah, we might not think to actually go back and open up the book of Ezra and start pulling out pieces of archived letters or statements or historical pieces and integrate them seamlessly into the prophecies and the story of Haggai and Zechariah. But thankfully that's what this does, and it's actually it kind of gives a really nice context to what we're doing there. One other side note, if I accidentally start saying Haggai or Zechariah, it's because when I was in 4th grade, we learned a Bible song that was sort of a mnemonic device to memorize the books of the Old Testament. And the very last line of the song goes Haggai, Zechariah, and the last one is Malachi. So if I'm mispronouncing, if I slip into the Haggai, that's why. They had to kind of tweak the pronunciation to fit it into the rhyming scheme of the song. So if I do that, I'm not talking. There's no separate book of the Bible. I'm not reaching into the Apocrypha or something like that. That's just me slipping into an old habit from when I was 8 years old. So. Okay, so with all of that kind of housekeeping out of the way, one other thing I wanted to do before we get to questions and finding yourself, or finding us and finding Christ in the story, is just to, over the next couple of weeks, we'll be kind of having a lot of history thrown out, a lot of what are the sequence of events. I wanted to lay out just really 3 guideposts to really help you as you're reading through not only this chapter, the book of Esther, and then the following chapter. There's sort of really 3 big moments that we should just keep in mind to kind of have us understand where are we in this broader overall story of the children of Israel, rebuilding the temple. So the first one is, I'll classify these by who is the Persian king that does the thing, okay? Because it's easier to kind of have that be kind of the guidepost. So the first is Cyrus the Great. He's the first one. And he is the one who gives the proclamation that the 50,000, the remnant of the children of Israel, can go back to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding the temple. Okay, so that's guidepost number 1. That's the first event. Cyrus sends the remnant back to Jerusalem. The second one is Darius. Darius is the one who the children of Israel appeal to, saying, hey, we're being harassed for rebuilding the temple. What's going on here? And he's the one who says, yes, this is permissible, and you should consecrate the temple. Okay, so we have the building of the temple, that's under Cyrus, he's the one who gives a green light for that. And then there's the consecration of the temple under Darius. That's signpost number 2. The third one then is under a guy whose name is going to sound kind of funny, is Artaxerxes. Okay? If you've ever seen the movie 300, you know who Xerxes is. Artaxerxes, no relationship. It's just, they just had a cool suffix or prefix in front of Xerxes instead of just Xerxes. Artaxerxes is the one who sends Ezra, the author of the book of Nehemiah, back to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So you have Cyrus, he's the one who green lights the temple. Darius, He's the one who says, yep, consecrate the temple, start worshiping there. And then Artaxerxes is the one that sends another wave of Israelites back, rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. Okay, so that's, if you keep those three things in mind, you kind of have an idea of where we're at in the story. You know, this week's section on Haggai and Zechariah, you know, that kind of fits in those first two buckets, right? There's Cyrus sending back, and then there's Darius greenlighting the project. And then the book of Esther, and then the next section will have the chapter the following week. That's kind of more in that overlap of that second and that third period of the consecration of the temple, and then the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. So that's kind of just as some guideposts for you to kind of keep things, because it is a little confusing because there's a lot of pieces. There's some jumping back and forth between who's saying what and everything. So with that, are there any questions before we get into the reading for this week?
So was that the King Cyrus who started greenlighting?
Yeah, sorry.
Is he a Christian?
No.
He said all of this stuff about, you know, it's your God and, you know.
Yeah.
And the Lord told me to send you back to do this.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we could say that he was a believer in Yahweh. I think the best we could say about what Cyrus the Great believed was that he took an interest in, so he ruled a very vast and diverse empire. And he was someone that had a particular interest in the variety of religions in his empire. And that is probably where his motivation comes from. Now, certainly, from our perspective, we would look at that and say, well, you weren't just motivated by your interest. Clearly, God had a prophecy of his own that he needed to fulfill, right? The prophecy was, you will be in exile for 70 years, and then you will be brought back. And Ezra, as we see, Ezra kind of pushes for the early dating of when should that clock start running in the 70 years. And so we know that there is a motivation beyond just Cyrus's generalized interest in the variety of religions, but it's not at all clear that he himself was worshiping Yahweh, for example. Like he wasn't necessarily in that, you know, he wasn't like that. So, good question. Any other questions?
Aaron, don't you think that God inspired or caused Cyrus to do those acts?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
And Cyrus, he was made aware of that. I think that's where acknowledgement came, but unfortunately, he never believed, I don't think. If he did, it was briefly.
It's certainly there. He may have chalked it up to mysticism or some sort of supernatural event, whether he understood that who was revealing or prompting this was in fact the true and ultimate God and not just a supernatural experience of his own. That could certainly be likely. It's certainly true, as you said, that Cyrus acknowledges that there is that your God is prompting me to do this, or that there's an acknowledgement of God. But I don't think it, as you said, I don't think it converted him over to, I'm a monotheistic worshiper of Yahweh now. He certainly was still, a pagan king, and probably considered himself, at least in some capacity, to be divine also. But yeah, good. Any other questions before go into? Okay. Well, good. All right. So as always, we'll start off with two big questions. Where do we find ourselves in this story of the remnant returning, the building of the temple? Where do we find ourselves?
When they went back and then they started, yet they got distracted doing other things when they should have been building the temple. Okay, yeah, right. That's God's admonition to them, right? You're living in wood paneled homes, and I'm sitting in my house is dilapidated. So what's going on here? Okay. And why was it? It
distraction, but what was going on there with that? What was going on with, you know, the remnant that are coming back from Babylon? They have a very specific, you know, mandate, right? We're going back, and we're going to rebuild the temple, right? And in fact, right, they get so far as to laying the foundations of the temple, right? And you remember the reaction of the people? What happened? As they lay the foundations, what happens?
Well, I mean, some were disappointed, I mean, some were, compared to the prior temple,
Yeah.
it was, you know, didn't compare.
Right. So some people who could remember the old temple, looked at this and said, well, this is pitiful. They despaired over how unmagnificent, how simple, how basic this temple was compared to what Solomon had built. Right? Solomon had made something that was, you know, a wonder of the world. It was majestic in nearly every respect, spared no expense. And this, by comparison, is just a square, a little bit of stone, maybe some wood chalked in there. Yeah, sure.
So that's why they were crying, they were remembering the grandness of them. I thought they were just emotional that they were rebuilding the temple.
So I think in there it is both. I think there is joy in that they're weeping for joy. There are some who are weeping for joy because here it's finally happening. We're back. We're in Jerusalem. We are rebuilding the temple. But there are also people, as Charlie said, it's both, right? And God actually has something to say to the people that are crying about the simplicity of the temple. What's God's message to them?
Wasn't his message pretty well telling him that you were building this temple, but there will be another temple to come? Meaning the coming of Christ?
Yes, yeah. So the idea is that, you know, you're weeping over the simplicity of this temple, but number one, this temple is going to be far greater than anything that had previously come. Now, part of that is both an earthly promise, and part of that is a heavenly promise, right? So we have an upper story and a lower story. It's a lower story promise in the sense that Herod eventually re-images the temple, and it is actually grand and majestic. It is unbelievably refined and gilded and glorious. But there is also this promise that what is actually being built here and the way that this temple will be exalted is specifically tied to Jesus. It's specifically tied to the fact that what he is ushering in is something that exceeds everything that has come before and everything that will come after. It's not only an allusion to Christ, it's an allusion to the church as we understand the church as being the invisible church, not just the physical establishments that we have. So,
Doesn't there also have to be some division among the people because they didn't near all go back? Some stayed and didn't even go back to Jerusalem to help in the building. Some stayed in the countries they were in.
The diaspora that you're talking about, the scattering of Israel. Certainly, even after Ezra comes back later on, when he's in kind of third signpost, there's archaeological evidence that say that there was still a Jewish presence in and around kind of Iran, Iraq, modern Iran and Iraq. There was still a Jewish presence there even after that second wave of resettlement came back. So there was always this sort of a kind of this diaspora of believers. So getting back to that idea of the church being rebuilt, as being left in its state, how would you describe God's reaction to all of that in this book? Is there a difference in his reaction, say in this section of Scripture, than to what had come prior to the Babylonian exile? Can you detect anything different in his reaction?
I'd have to read it again, but in my head, I kind of remember thinking, he really wasn't real sure this was gonna work, and so he was covering the bases.
Okay. I think one of the things that may be part of what we can see here is if we can actually pull up the story. I won't read it directly because I think it really is a nice. If you go to page 267, if you have your stories in front of you. Or wait. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. I am with you. You see that message time and time again. You see that message to Zerubbabel. You see that message to Joshua, the priest. You see this message of comfort and encouragement, that this seems really hard right now. This seems incredibly difficult. You know, you've lost your way, you've meandered off the path once again. And yet, I'm with you. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to continue to sustain you. Even though it seems like your priorities are all messed up, and they are, I'm with you. Readjust, rebuild, I'm going to be with you. And it's one of the reasons why the prophet Zechariah is called one of the comfort prophets, because a lot of his, Haggai and Zechariah both, the message is one of the reconciliation that God has promised is at hand. And he is here to ensure that reconciliation takes place. And again, often kicking and screaming from the fact of the children of Israel, right? I mean, they neglect, it becomes hard. You have that quote right from Haggai 1 verse 2. This is a good one of those kind of ways of reading the Bible, like we talked about in our small group. Whenever God asks a question, it's usually not that he's lacking information, right? Like, it's one of those things that when you're reading it, when you see a question asked, it's always that the recipient of the question has something to learn, not God. He's not looking for information. Another good little guidepost in reading Scripture is that when God refers to these people versus my people, right? If he says that these people are doing X versus my people are doing, that's usually an indication that there's some sort of corrective action that's going to be so, because he isn't claiming them at that time as having behaved in a way worthy of the title my people. It's saying these people. And Haggai begins it with that. You know, he says these people. God's admonition to them is, you've planted much but harvested little. You eat but never have enough. You drink but never have your fill. You put on clothes but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it, right? They're constantly seeking and desiring something that's putting up roadblocks in their lives. They aren't moving forward. They're always seeking the wrong thing. How many of you could have seen this coming? I have a C.S. Lewis quote for it. Exactly to this. Because that admonition that God has for them of what are you seeking? What are you desiring? What are you trying to fill your life with? C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity has this, I think, dialed in and just bullseye. It's a little longer quote, but it's one of my favorites. The Christian says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hungry. Well, there must be such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there must be such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desires, so there must be such a thing as sex. If I find myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. And if that is so, I must take care on the one hand never to despise or to be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of copy, echo, or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which
which I shall not find until after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of my life to press on to that country and to help others do the same. Lewis's point would be all those things that God's talking about there, harvesting, working, those are all good things. And to desire those things are not necessarily bad in and of themselves. But recognize that those things are simply a foretaste, or they're a brief glimpse of the things that we really ought to be desiring, right? Jesus himself, right? He describes himself as the bread of life, the water of life, right? He's an analogy for all those things, because the idea being that, yes, we need those things. We need to desire food, right? We get hungry, we get thirsty, we want companionship. We feel the desires for those things. But those things are just the imitation of the things that we truly need. The things we truly need, the things that Christ brings. The things we truly need are encapsulated in the Gospels. That's what we truly need. And that's what God's reminding them of, right? And that's one of the reasons why when God looks at the temple and he says, look, what you're building, how grand it is, that's not the point, right? Think of in the New Testament, right? The widow's mite, right? She gives a pittance, literally, and yet Jesus says she is given more than anyone else. And it isn't just the idea of it's proportionally more. It's that what is here, as she's giving that, is magnificent. She's utterly selfless in what she's giving. And the people here are working here to rebuild God's home. And for him, he said, look, this, you're worshiping me. This is what I desire from you. Your faithfulness, your vocational obedience to me. This is what I desire from you. Turn your hearts to me. Not to whether or not it's grand. It's not the point. God doesn't need our offerings. God doesn't need that. We need to give our offerings. We need to be dedicated to God because that is our worship of him. God doesn't need those things. He desires them. Okay.
Well, that kind of what Pastor said in the sermon, that the word in the Old Testament for prayer and service is the same word.
Need, yeah.
So when we're praying to God, we're serving.
Serving, yeah.
By the same token, when we're serving Him,
yeah.
we're praising Him.
Yes, yeah. That's a very good point. Yeah. It's like a professor of mine used to say that you should always pray before you act, but always act after you pray. It's not sufficient just to say I'm going to pray to do something, right? God, and you know, read through the Gospels, right? Yeah, it's necessary. But what's the Great Commission? Go and make disciples of all nations, right? That's, you see at the end of the C.S. Lewis quote, right? It's not just that I want to desire that far-off country that I was made for, but that I have an obligation to help get others there too. And the children of Israel, they have an obligation to rebuild the temple. We have to be worshiping and praising our God. And it's not just that they're doing the work. It's not that they're working their own righteousness. They're serving God. They're having the priority list be arranged appropriately in their life, finally. They aren't just going to seek and harvest for the sake of eating, and then wondering, why am I never satisfied by this? Yeah, I think let's even see on page 268, you see that clarified for us even more. This comes out of page 268 at the top. This is what the Lord Almighty, here's the bottom of 267 again, part of that quote of what is God's reaction to all of this? Who have you left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? This is him talking to people who are weeping over looking at the fact that the temple now is a shadow of what it was prior to this. Be now strong, Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work, for I am with you. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations. And what is desired by all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord. The silver is mine, the gold is mine, declares the Lord. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord. That key phrase right there, right? What is desired by all nations will come, right? What is that? What is he talking about there? Christ. What is desired by the nations will finally come. And when God says he's going to shake up the, he's not talking about physical earthquakes. He's talking about what is about to happen. What I will send to you is going to be the most disruptive thing in all of history. It is God incarnating himself into this world and finally carrying out the rescue plan. The salvation, the reunification between God and man through Christ. That is what he is promising. Whenever I would draw, I had a philosophy professor who would always draw a timeline of sort of the history of philosophy. And he would draw a straight line, and he'd start with someone like Socrates over here, about 400 BC, and then he'd go through Xenophanes and Aristophanes, all these other Greek sounding names. It all sound the same. They all end up talking about like fire and water and stuff like that. But then he'd get to this point right about here, and he'd draw a little cup, and then he'd keep going and drawing a line. And the reason he would draw a cup right there is that's where he put Christ. And the reason why he would draw a cup right there is that the flow of history and time is so bent and changed by Christ coming that it actually causes a dip in the timeline that we have to pause and look. Because that is the most monumentally significant thing that has ever happened, is looking at that. You have to stop and look, because what happens there is definitive for the entire human race. And it's, again, even think about today, it's the thing that all nations desire. Right? God is making a declaration there of what is the size of the hole in our hearts, right? It's a God, I mean, we talked about this word, it's a God-shaped hole in our hearts, and we're always trying to fill it with everything else except for that. That's what God is declaring right there. It's like, you all have this desire, you all have this need, you all have this awareness. What I am going to do is I'm going to send you someone that is going to satisfy this finally. It's going to be the thing that you needed. And to your point before, Donna, is the idea that the temple that's going to be built here is far more majestic than what happens with Solomon, right? Because this is the temple of Christ. This is Christ ushering in utterly different version of history, and utterly different version of the relationship with God. He's completely changing the game with this. So, well, that probably, unfortunately, answers the question of where do we find Christ in all of this? Always good when the teacher does the homework for the students then and says, oh yeah, you know. But good. But are there any other places that you can think of where we saw Christ in the story, or where we find Christ in the story, apart from that prophecy right there? Are there other places that we see Christ in this story?
The only thing I can think of is it's a new beginning. They went back to Jerusalem to build the temple.
Sure.
And the beginning, Christ was the new beginning.
I think that's a good observation. The idea, and along with that, the idea that God is entirely faithful in his promises, right? He promises that the exile is only going to be for a set amount of time, and that there will be a remnant that returns. God is perfectly able and always does fulfill his promises. And so in that same way that the children of Israel as sort of both a literal and also symbolic idea of God is faithful. Look, they were in exile and yet they have returned. The same thing then is true, that if God is promising, I am sending someone that will be the object of what you actually should be desiring, that he is also faithful. And that is in fact then what Christ is for us. That is in fact what Christ says, that we can believe and trust that God is in fact faithful in that way. That we are not, he isn't subject to changing his mind. He isn't subject to not really living up to his end of the bargain. And even quotes that, he's right, look, I have a covenant relationship with you, even going back to Egypt, right? I'm faithful in all of this to you. I am steady, I am steadfast. I will be with you. Do not fear. It's incredible reassurance. So yeah, good.
Yeah, I don't think it could be understated how much reassurance it would take. I mean, these people were fairly comfortable after 70 years of being in a foreign country.
Sure, yeah.
And he's asking a very small number compared to what left Egypt to go back to a land, and travel then was not great. I mean, you're talking about foot and horse and camel, and you're bringing gold and silver with you. You're set up to be attacked. They have no army. They can't defend themselves. And to go back to this country, to the place which has been destroyed, and to rebuild. I mean, it took only him giving them the faith would cause anybody to, it's almost more impressive than the first Exodus.
Sure, yeah, right, yeah. I think that's a very good point, yeah. And we even see how susceptible they are to pressure, right? Their neighbors just start asking questions and start investigating them, and their only recourse is not to rally their army to try to defend themselves. They have to go appeal to Babylon, because they don't have the physical capacity to do anything. They don't have the physical ability to resist their neighbors. And yeah, that's a I never thought about that, Charlie. That's a good way of putting it. They're traveling with riches and wealth across terrain that isn't. I would be very skeptical to drive around with a transparent briefcase full of money. Even to, right? I mean, I wouldn't do that. I mean, that would be really. Let alone have it on the top of my car, so that as I play up to every intersection, people can glance over and be like, "Is that really? Is that?" Right, and that's essentially what the remnant of Israel are doing. And notice how when it lists at the beginning of the story, it lists who they're bringing along with them. Did you notice how many soldiers were accompanying them? No, right? It's singers. That's good, right? I mean, but we're not talking about it's not like it's 50,000 heavily armed Israelite soldiers are going to just march, in force. But no, it's singers and dancers and musicians and then it's a remnant of people that are going with, it's a construction crew. And then, the worship ensemble. That's it. It's not, they're not, and they don't have an escort, right? So it's a good, and I think that raises that word of comfort that God gives to Zerubbabel and to Joshua and to the rest of the people. Be strong. Be strong. You might feel overwhelmed, but I don't break my promises to you. Be strong. Don't fear. If you hear, I think, in that an echo of what God says to the children of Israel before they cross the Red Sea, I think that would be good, right? The admonition is the children of Israel are backed up to the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army is closing in on them. And it's tactically, from a military standpoint, there is no hope, right? They aren't going to be able to defend themselves against one of the world's greatest land army, bearing down on them with all of their might, all of their power. And what's God's message to them via Moses? Don't fear, for I'm going to fight for you today. That's it. One sentence. Don't fear. I'm going to fight for you today. And what happens? They survive. They cross the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army is wiped out. Similarly, here, we have that same promise. Don't fear. And ultimately, the children of Israel, they're thrown out by their enemies. They aren't robbed blind of all of their riches. The temple is rebuilt. And in fact, another wave of remnants come back, right? God is faithful. He's faithful in a way that may be unexpected, in that the letter from Cyrus via Darius is brought back, and suddenly, not only is Tatiana said, not only is it like, yeah, no, first of all, they're not only able to rebuild the temple, but you actually have to provide them money and animals for sacrifice if they want it. So just listen when you will be at their beck and call from now on. How do you know? Imagine Joshua's Zerubbabel's reaction. This guy who was threatening that, are you really supposed to be building this temple right now? You're building, no, you're not supposed to. No, instead, you're now the new, like, DoorDash for me. I need 100 bulls. Oh, okay, yeah. I need some timber from Tyre and Sidon. Yeah, we're on that. We're gonna go get that for you. No, he turns into their errand boy. And it isn't, God striking him blind. It's God using a different means, and unexpected means that wouldn't have been obvious. But that's, as we've seen throughout the story, that is God's MO throughout the Old Testament. Is the unexpected path, is the path that He chooses, so that it is obvious that He is the one worthy of honor and glory. It's not the kind of people involved in the story directly. So, all right. Well, any other parting questions or thoughts before we wrap up?
Just one, in the previous prophets, before the fall, before they were in exile, even Elijah and the prophets, they would always speak to condemnation of God. But then sometimes even before and after, God would always promise deliverance.
Right.
And for the people at that time, it had to be confusing. I know if my parents were going to give me a spanking and said, I'm going to forgive you afterwards, I'd say, well, just forget the spanking.
Yeah, let's just forego the spanking.
Forgive me, and then God is fulfilling that promise. So they had to be seeing that, in the end, as the temple's being built. I forgive you, and I'm with you.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. But it also taught me something about myself in that hindsight's 20/20. I can see that forgiveness that God has given in the past. I can see what He's done through my life in the past.
Yeah.
But I still worry about tomorrow. I still worry about today because, I know He's in charge, but I can't see it as I can. And that's exactly what's happening with the people at that time, leading safely and coming back to Jerusalem.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it. Is that we are the way that we can look back and see see the comfort, see the forgiveness of God, see His hand, or imagine that we see God's hand in our lives, and yet because the future is unknown, and because we don't know what's going to happen next, it can be harder to. And yet, I would say that to that idea of the steadfastness of God and the faithfulness of God is the comfort for us, because although the future is unknown, God's relationship to us is not. That is known definitively. That He is in fact faithful. That He is a God of love and forgiveness, and that He is a God who will carry us through, even if, like, if the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as they're standing in front of the furnace, they never doubted God's ability to save them, but they never presumed to know what God had intended for them. They didn't know what His will was, but they weren't going to presume to know what God's will was for them. But they were convinced beyond words that God has the ability to save us. And that's true in our own lives, right? I mean, God has the ability to alter our lives in a way that might be more earthly pleasing or more beneficial to us. The challenge is, do we
doubt God's will. We shouldn't presume to know what His will is for us. That's one of the dangers, is to see that. But yeah, no, it's a good point, and it's a struggle that we as sinful people will always have. The uncertainty of the future, the lack of knowledge, the realization of our own frailty, our own mortality, the frailty and mortality of those we love. I mean, those are all things that are challenges and that will always be struggles. And yet it's the reminder of God's faithfulness, that even in those struggles that we are kept in His hand. But interesting note also, just the book of Zechariah. Zechariah as a name means the Lord remembers. And so it's got this beautiful comfort of the whole book, right? It's like the theme of the book is the Lord remembers. We might not, and we don't all the time, right? We definitely don't, but God does. And what does God remember? Well, He remembers His covenant. He remembers His faithfulness. He remembers His promises to us. And that is a comfort that we can always rely on. That is God is faithful, and He does remember. He remembers His mercy, His compassion for us. So, all right, great. Well, any other questions before we wrap up? Okay. Well, so next week we're going to have a really interesting book. We have the book of Esther. There's a lot of things that are very unique about the book of Esther. I won't get into it right now, but it's a very unique book in the Old Testament. And yeah, I think it'll be a very interesting class, because Esther is a very interesting character in the Old Testament. And the book of Esther itself, as a piece of literature, is very interesting, well, especially within the Bible. So, okay, well, let's bow our heads and say the Lord's Prayer, and we'll be happy then. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.